So welcome everybody back to the Australian camp meeting for this weekend. My name's Rachel. I'm going to be doing 2 presentations for you today. To give you some context, what I'll be presenting today. I've been reviewing the fight for gay marriage. And before we begin this study, I'd like to ask you to kneel in prayer. Our dear God in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity to gather together and try and understand that about the world that we live in. And understand what your kingdom is about. And every day work towards living as if we were in your kingdom. Please be with us all now. As we go through this study. We ask this all in your name, Jesus. Amen. Thank you. So as I was saying, to give you a bit of context about what I'll be presenting. So as we saw through these studies, the fight for gay marriage the fight for gay marriage all fit perfectly on our reform line. And we know our methodology. The lines and the dates are also very important because they help us to understand where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. So prophecy. But what also is really important is the real people that have lived through these events and these dates. The discrimination and humiliation that they have had to endure. Not to mention the financial burdens. To be treated like an equal citizen in society. So in that study, there was a story of 2 couples. Edie Windsor and Thea Spires. John Arthur and Jim Obergefell. And how their court cases took down Section 3 and Section 2 of the Defence of Marriage Act. So these couples represent many couples around the world. And learning about their story helped us to understand what they've been through. And it was to do something very natural for them to do. And it was to simply marry the person that they loved. So I had a big question while doing this review. And that was a big why. Why did people even have to fight? Why did they have to fight against laws and legislation? To have those equal relationships recognised. So the problem is things that have happened in the past they still affect the present. So when we're talking about the fight for gay marriage, things that happened before 1989 continued. And these stigmas were built on misdiagnosis, misinformation and misinterpretation, from the past. So I hope today I can give you a little snapshot of why. Why the LGBTQI+ community has been treated this way. And where this mindset comes from. So once again, it's a very complicated history. So it's quite difficult to cover every aspect of this subject. So I've pulled out one strand to focus on what happened before 1989. So to find some answers, we're going back to our favourite subject, history. So we've seen in ancient Greece and Rome what the social construct was back then. But what about modern history? So we're just going back just before 1989. So today I'm writing on this is not a reform line. It's just a timeline of history. The reason why I want to walk through this history is to see what's happening to the LGBTQ community in the medical, political, and religious fields. So medical, and this all comes under a society. So this is not a very nice time for this community to go through. It's actually a very horrible time for this community. But as we go over this time, we can see what it's like to walk in their shoes. With people who've been discriminated against, mistreated and misunderstood. So the line's tracking mostly what's happened in the US and Germany. So I'm going to start on the year 1868. And we know there's a lot of thoughts. There are a lot of thoughts and ideas originated well before this time. But it's a starting point for us today. And the reason it's a starting point is because it's when the word homosexual was coined. So when we jump back to this history, we need to put the right lenses on. To see this is mostly all about men. So men dominated the medical and the science fields. The lawmaking and political realms. So there's not many women in these fields. So it's not what's happening to a woman's body that we're focused on. What we're looking at is what men are doing with their bodies. So throughout this time, I'm going to mention a lot of different people. But this is really just a scraping of the surface about who they are. And how they are connected on this line. So before we go to this line, I just want to bring in a simple model. To describe the moral sexual ethics of the time. we've got to remember this is about men. So if we think of what good sex and bad sex is, so good sex is what they consider normal. And it's about procreation. So you end up with dominant, male dominant. And we're talking about who would be the penetrator. So it's about the role that you played. And if we think of bad sex model, it's just the opposite. So non-procreative. So non-male dominant. And also under that, we have any equal same-sex relations. Excessive and lustful sex. Excessive, a lot of. Yeah, we'll talk. And masturbation. So bad sex is when the sperm's wasted. Because back then it was not, it was thought that the sperm contained the whole of the baby. So it wasn't until 1870 that they realised it was actually a sperm and an egg that made a baby. So you can't waste anything. Anything that wasn't procreative was considered bad. So let's start in looking at the medical world. We're starting at 1868, and there's a guy called Carl Kurtberry. So he's an Hungarian journalist. And he's observing men of equal status. And he sees men of equal status forming relationships together. And he's noticing that they're falling in love. So he's seeing these relationships and he wants to be able to describe them. So he writes his observations and he gives them a name. He titles the names after who the people are attracted to. So not the role you play, but who you're attracted to. So heterosexual and homosexual. These are the two words that he's uses to describe the observations he's seen. So heterosexual changes, the word heterosexual changes with time. And becomes normalised. But back then, it was about the attractions involved. So it would be the opposite sex, same sex. Sex with children, with animals, and it would be lustful and excessive. But so it's who they're attracted to, but they would usually end up marrying a man. Remember this, sorry, a woman. This is all about being a man. Sorry. So homosexual is they're attracted to the opposite sex. (1869). Carl Westphal. So he's a German psychiatrist from Berlin. And he's seen these attractions and wondering what's happening. And he writes a paper on several cases. So he calls what he's seeing contrary sexual feelings. So to explain that, if I'm a man and inside of me I'm supposed to love a woman, but if I fall in love with a man, then it's contrary. So this word contrary gets changed into the English word later on. To sexual invert. So if I was to draw this so you can understand, it's about, I was talking about men. So we would have a person that would represent a masculine and feminine. So we have the active and the passive here. So one would be female-like. Because they can't get the idea or the concept that it's not about being female or male. So over time, the sexual inverts are given some feminine slang names. So Pansy, Nancy, and Fairy. Because you don't want to be seen like, you don't want to be seen as female. So in 1870, lots is happening in the medical world. What you said, they have discovered it's a sperm and an egg that makes a baby. What else happens is psychology is established. As an academic discipline. So people start to talk more about their feelings. And this gets more recognition for when World War I comes along. So in 1886, there's a German psychiatrist, Richard von Krafft-Ebing. And he writes a book. And it's the first text about sexual pathology. And he comes up with some theories. To define homosexuality. And he comes to the conclusion. He said sex was primarily for procreation. And if the sexual act didn't involve procreation, it was a perversion. So he's saying that homosexuality is a sexual perversion. He goes on to say in his book, it's not really a crime or a sin. Back here, it was kind of like a mystery. But now he's saying that there's something mentally wrong because it's not normal. Because men are really supposed to be attracted to women. So it's all about procreation. So because it's not normal, he says it's a mental illness. And then we've got the 1900s. And we have Freud, who's the founder of psychoanalysis. This is some deep water that I don't want to touch. But he's also looking at men who should be attracted to women. And he's wondering where they come from. And he has his own theories of why people are homosexual. You may have heard the popular term smothering mother and distant father. He has other his position changes before he dies, but people don't look at the end, at what people say at the end. And later on, these theories get misused. So let's just touch on what's happening in the political realm. So we have the First World War, and soldiers are coming home from war, and they've experienced the horrors of the war and the effect on their mental state. And they're broken from the war. So this is where psychology comes more to the forefront. But if you're a homosexual in the military, you would be discharged because of your sexual orientation. Mm-hmm. 1920. So this is the Roaring Twenties in America. And there's a lot happening in society. But we're focusing on homosexuality. So in the 1920s, there was a climate of accepting of homosexuals. They weren't seen as a threat at all. I just want to read from that article 1. The 1920s saw the flourishing of the LGBTQ nightclub and culture. It reached beyond the cities, across the country, and into ordinary American homes. Though New York City may have been the epicenter of the so-called pansy craze, gay, lesbian, and transgender performers graced the stages of the night spots in cities and all over the country. The audiences included many straight men and women. So eager to experience a culture themselves. As well as ordinary LGBTQ Americans. Seeking to expand their social networks and find romance or partners. But all this came to an end. Before the 1930s, we saw there's not much persecution towards homosexuals in society. But unfortunately, this changes dramatically in the 1930s. And the beginning of the Great Depression. The Article 2. The 1930s, the onset of the Depression and the coming of World War II. The LGBTQ culture and community began to fall out of favour. As a backlash began in the 1930s. As a part of a wider Depression era condemnation of the culture experimentation of the 1920s. Which many blamed for the economic collapse. So they're blaming what happened in the 1920s on their economic downfall. So the sale of liquor was legal again. But newly enforced laws and legislations prohibited restaurants from hiring gay employees or even serving gay patrons. In the mid to late 30s, a wave of sensationalised sex crimes provoked hysteria about sexual crimes who were often, in the mind of the public and the mind of authorities, equated with gay men. This not only discouraged gay men from participating in public life, but also made homosexuality seem more dangerous to the average American. So anti-gay legislation became common throughout the 1930s. And the gay community went underground, many disappearing into the closet forever. And those who still managed to remain in the life foster close relationships, but for many, it was not easy or even possible. So we can see in the 1930s, it was I just lost my thought. We saw in the 1930s, homosexuality became persecuted. Persecutions began on homosexuals. Yeah. So this blaming of people's sexual orientation for devastating events in history is a recurring theme. So we have World War II. And we're just talking about in Germany, it was the Centre for Human Sexual Studies. So back to the medical. In 1919, the Institute of Sexual Research was established. It was pioneer modern gender affirming healthcare. And they had thousands of records and research papers on sexual inverts. But now the political climate changes, Nazi Germany. So you've got the Nazi book burnings in Berlin. Which included all the archives of the Institute. So all that library was destroyed. So 20,000 books and 5,000 images are burned. The psychologists and psychiatrists are taken to concentration camps. Some are murdered and some are able to flee Nazi Germany. So some, they're mainly German Jews, immigrate to England, but some go to America. So the Nazi regime carry out a campaign against the homosexual community. And they call it paragraph 175. For the German Criminal Code. So 50,000 men were convicted of violation of this 175. And the reason why, one of the reasons why the community in Germany was hit so hard by the Nazis is about eugenics. Most of you might understand what that is. If that's okay, I'll just read a little bit for those that may not be familiar. So eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices that aim to improve the genetic quality of a human population, so historically, eugenics have attempted to alter human gene pools by excluding people and groups targeted to be inferior or promoting those judged to be superior. Read Article 3. So in 1907, we're going back into America. So the history of legalised forced sterilisation by the government begins in 1907. When Indiana became the first state to pass an eugenics law, providing for the involuntary sterilisation of confirmed criminals, idiots, imbeciles, and rapists. Those affected were mainly men, viewed to be criminalistic, including those with a defect, who supposedly excessive masturbation or homosexuality. So, after the eugenics movement was well established in the United States, it spreads to Germany. So California eugenicists began producing literature promoting eugenics and sterilisation. And sending it overseas to Germany scientists and medical professors. By 1933, California had subjected more people to forced sterilisation than all other US states combined. So this forced sterilisation program engineered by the Nazis was partly inspired in California. So Hitler reads all about racial hygiene during his imprisonment in 1924. but he takes it to an extreme level. So back in the USA, these psychiatrists and psychologists who fled Nazi Germany have, so they're German Jews and they've come to America in the Victorian era. And because of the way that they were received by society, they went into hiding. They began to regress on the way that they would be looking at these sexual inverts. Before they had a progressive understanding, but now they're regressed. And their conclusion is they are sexually broken and they've added, yes, they are mentally ill. Now, we've been talking about a lot of dates and medical times. But one of the biggest problems that I've found while looking at all these things is that all these with all these conclusions and theories, were done on people that were either in treatment, in an institution, or in jail. But never were they done in a controlled environment. So now, because it's a medical term, because homosexuality is now a medical term, so then it needs to be treated medically. So before it was about their feelings, now physical treatments have come to the forefront. To try and change their sexual orientation. So this is when conversion therapy begins. So electric shock treatment, chemical drugs to make you sick. So you've got castration, hormone injections. To brain surgeries, lobotomies, which they use an ice pick through your eye. It's nice. And that's just a few. So in 1945, World War II ends. The men are coming back from the war and women are going back home. and they're all getting married younger and having lots of babies. So 1946, we've got the baby boom. So everybody can see who's getting married and who's not. Because the social climate's tilted towards traditional gender roles. So the American society is based on that nuclear family, which offers a heterosexual model. So heterosexual model is the nuclear family and traditional gender roles. And a homosexual model is sexually broken and mentally ill. And if you're homosexual, then you're a threat to the family. So they need to protect their children. So the fear about protecting your children escalates. And that's another recurring theme through history. Then we have the Cold War. And we've talked about this before, so I'm just going to briefly mention it. And we've talked about the Lavender Scare, which is a parallel persecution. So you've got the Red Scare and the Lavender, the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare. Which is communism and homosexuality. So they're saying if you're homosexual, you are more likely to be a communist. So now the LGBTQ community are treated as a national security threat. So back here, you're a threat to the family. And now you're a threat to the whole country. In 1953, there's an executive order and they called it the 10-450. So basically, federal employees were being investigated. So to determine whether they were a security risk. So they said anybody that was homosexual or suspected to be homosexual, they couldn't work in any state department jobs. So this continues all the way through the 50s. I'm just doing a quick time check to see. 10 minutes, okay. Thank you. I just want to give a quick story how this order can impact someone's life and country. There's a guy named Frank Kemi. So he's an astronomer. He graduated at Harvard with 2 degrees by the time he was 18. So he's brilliant. He's working for the government. And while he was in a stopover in San Francisco, he's approached by a man. He doesn't know this person. But the undercover police see that he's touched by this man and they arrest him. And he's saying, please don't arrest me. I'm a federal employee. And I'll get fired. But they arrest him. So he's put on a 3-year probation. And then they were going to drop the charges. But in 1957, he's working for the US Army map service. And they hear about his arrest in San Francisco. His superiors question him. But he refuses to give information regarding his sexual orientation. And he's fired. I'm just going to shorten that story for time. But he's such a smart guy that he fights back. So he becomes a gay activist. And he spends his whole life fighting for gay rights. I'll write his name if you want to have a look at his name. So Frank. So his whole career was destroyed because of this 10-4-50. So a year before, in 1952, to add fuel to the already burning fire against homosexuals. The APA, which is the American Psychiatric Association, puts in their diagnostic manual for mental illness that homosexual is listed as a sociopathic personality disturbance. No, that's okay. Sociopathic disturbance. So as I said before, a lot of these observations are done on homosexuals in treatment and in prison. And nobody's ever done a controlled study comparing their homosexual patients with non-patient homosexuals. Comparing non-patient heterosexuals with non-patient homosexuals. So I want to call this a turning point in history. Because this had never happened before until Evelyn Hooker comes along. So just to quickly summarize, we're walking through this timeline to see how the medical, political, and world treated the LGBT community. A lot of theories and conclusions. Paranoia and hysteria. So these people are cast out of society. Labelled mentally ill, perverts, criminals. A threat to your family and for your country. So what do you do when you're being told you are sick? You try and get cured. And that's what a lot of people did. They spent a lot of time and money in therapy. To get over an illness that they never had. And there was no solid scientific evidence to prove any of this was true. We'll close for now in prayer and have a 10-minute break. I'll just ask if you would. Thank you. Our God in heaven, as we walk through this timeline, to see the injustice and discrimination help us to understand that these things still are happening to people on a daily basis. And understanding these things help us to have empathy for those that have been wrongly have been done wrong by. We thank you in your name, Jesus. Amen.